Hi everyone, I'm the true crime psychologist. My name is Amrit, and I'm a clinical psychologist in Sydney, Australia, who has worked in a lot of different settings, but have worked in the forensic setting, not as a forensic psychologist, but as a clinician in a jail. That was one of my early roles. I'm now in private practice, but I have a very strong interest in true crime dating back to childhood. And the Delphi case is one that I've got lots of thoughts on, and I think there's amazing lawyers on YouTube talking about this case, some amazing voices of journalists and other people who have really dived into this evidence and provided some really good commentary. But I think I can give a little bit of a unique perspective as a clinical psychologist, and that's what I'm going to do today. Now, before I get started, this isn't filmed very well. I'm laying on my couch, not feeling particularly well today. So this is a bit of an amateur video, but I have some big thoughts and I wanted to speak about them. I'm going to read a little bit off my iPad where I have documented some of my thoughts so that there is at least a little bit of structure, but I am a rambler, so apologies if that's a bit annoying. This is probably more something to listen to rather than watch because I don't know if you want to see me being a bit unwell and moving the camera around. But anyway, let's get to it. So today's video is my thoughts on the interrogation videos and the phone calls that were released this week in relation to the Delphi case. So I'm going to give you some thoughts around how I see what's going on as a psychologist. So the first point I want to make today before I go into my analysis is a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is that I would say that at this point I'm leaning a little bit more towards the not guilty camp. And I would say that if I based it purely on the evidence, the sort of physical evidence, the circumstantial evidence, I'd probably lean guilty. But there's just some compelling psychological aspects, and sometimes I can't even 100% put my finger on it. I'm trying to do that in this video, but yeah, I feel very invested in the idea that he isn't guilty, and that's not because I'm trying to be a fangirl. And I know that a lot of people are getting hate for seeing potential innocence in Richard Allen, but more so because my assessment from the material that I have, which of course is limited, I just am not getting the sense that he meets the profile of this killer. So I know that's a contentious point, and it may mean that some of you will stop watching right now, but please keep an open mind. I do keep an open mind, and I've debated this for hours and hours with ChatGPT because nobody else in my life wants to actually talk about this case, and really tried to kind of figure out where I sit with this. And I've always sort of sat in the middle. But I think when I really put into words all of the observations I make as a psychologist, I am starting to lean a little bit more towards not guilty, but also acknowledging that I'm not a big conspiracy theorist either. So anyway, I'm on the fence. Let's jump in because you probably want to hear more of the analysis rather than what I think as a person. So like I said, I'll read off the iPad, but I'll also just sort of speak off the top of my head. So like I said, this will be rambling. It'll probably go on for a while because I have a lot of thoughts. So let's start with the interrogation because I'm going to go in sort of chronological order rather than start with the phone calls, which I know a lot of us would have heard first. So if we go to the interrogation video, the one, and I don't know the dates, but the first one, where basically he's been called in after 5 years to just give an updated statement, being someone who had been at the bridge that day. What I see is a comfortable, calm person who is being asked some questions about what his movements were on that day. And at that point, of course, there'd be a little bit of a suspicion in his mind because also they were questioning his wife, I believe, or was that the next time? Maybe it was the next time. So I think there probably wasn't a lot of suspicion in his mind. He thinks, well, yeah, I was on the bridge that day. I told people I was on the bridge that day. I wasn't there at the time of the crime. And so they had this renewed kind of lease of life on the investigation in 2022. So he's come in thinking they're probably routinely, finding out more about everybody's story. Now, probably the thing that would have maybe made me suspicious in his case would have been that they came to his house and they escorted him to the police station. That to me is a little bit odd. Like, I think if I had been a potential witness to something years ago, and I felt like nobody ever was going to think it was me, I would find it a bit odd that they were escorting me to the police station. So there's a little part there where you're like, he may have been a little bit suspicious and nervous, but I guess overall, he seems pretty calm. And that is not an indication of guilt, because I think some people think if you're too calm, that must mean that, you're guilty or psychopathic because you're really keeping a hold on all of your emotions. But I really try to put myself in his shoes. And if something had happened somewhere that I'd been, but I knew I was not at all related to it, and they brought me in, I'd probably be a little bit nervous internally, but I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they were going to arrest me for that crime. So in the first part of that interview, I mean, they're just talking quite casually. He's not defensive. He's giving information quite clearly. It is consistent with what he said before. Side note, I'm not sure that the report by Doolan had the right timing. He was cleared for a reason, and I believe the reason he was cleared was because he was actually at the bridge earlier, and maybe his phone records showed that. But for whatever reason on that day, Doolan did not take this particularly seriously. Now, it could be that Doolan is just completely doesn't understand, what his job is, but I highly doubt that. I think it's more likely that he saw something on that day that made him feel this person's not even a red flag at all. Because otherwise, given that Bridge Guy video and the descriptions, of course you would look into Richard Allen, right? Even if he was telling you a different time. So I think that my feeling is that that video is not recorded, so we don't know. And I'm not saying anyone's actively, deliberately lying, but I am feeling like there could be a mistake there that has been, misunderstood and then led down this path 5 years later. I mean, I know there's a mistake with the name, not pretending I don't see that, but as in terms of him being cleared, I feel like there was a reason at the time that he was cleared. So he's come in, he's talking, and as the conversation starts to get a little bit more accusatory, he does start to kind of go, no, of course not. And he starts to act again like I think I would in that situation. If somebody now pulls me in and says to me, Amrit, you were here yesterday and people saw you committing a crime, I'd be like, but they couldn't have, because I didn't do that. Like, I feel like his reaction is quite similar to how I would react. I might be a bit more anxious, but that's because I'm a really anxious person. My core belief is I'm going to be in trouble, right? And that's because I have a long history of anxiety that makes me constantly be on edge about doing the wrong thing and getting in trouble. Now, Richard Allen may or may not have that belief system too. He is older than me, and I'm finding that belief system reduces in time, and I have more confidence. So I just think he presents as a very normal reaction to the situation. As the interview progresses, he starts to get frustrated, understandably. When you're going around in circles and people are asking you questions that you just feel ridiculous and confusing because you don't even know what they're talking about, you're going to start feeling frustrated. It's almost like gaslighting. And I'm not trying to say that the police interviews are deliberately gaslighting, but when you're telling somebody something that you know to be true and nobody's listening to you, you would get frustrated. Anybody would. So a roundup of that first interview, their main observations would be that he's quite casual and friendly. He starts to get increasingly confused and then frustrated. And to me, that's quite a common pattern that we would see in anybody being falsely kind of not accused, but having suggestions that he may have been involved. He also, and I can't remember which video this is in or whether it's in both, it probably is in both, he a number of times says, I'm done with this, I want to go. But interestingly, you notice he doesn't go. Now, from a psychologist's opinion, my sense there is a lack of assertiveness. He doesn't go, he doesn't ask for a lawyer, he doesn't say, this is ridiculous, I'm leaving, I don't need to be here. He sits it out. Now, as an innocent person, because I've never committed any serious crimes, that's what I'd be like too, because I would actually be more worried that getting up and leaving would make me actually look guilty when I'm not. Just as, I think it's a common thing that a lot of us think if I ask for a lawyer, I'm going to look guilty. I'm going to look like I've got something to hide. Like I would really struggle with lawyers telling me to say no comment if I haven't committed a crime because I'm like, that just makes me look so guilty. Now I know, honestly, I know the advice that we would give to anyone is if you're ever being interrogated or questioned for a crime, whether you committed it or didn't, get a lawyer. But I would be more inclined to be like Richard Allen, a little bit passive in that situation and just keep going and answering the questions. So, again, I guess my perspective is coming as a psychologist, but also as a person with a history of anxiety and, being a little bit cautious about, offending other people and worrying about what they think of me. So, from that perspective, from my own lived experience perspective, I'm actually saying I'd probably react quite similarly to him. We go on to the second interview, and obviously at this stage, he is more concerned. He is absolutely more concerned because they've raided his house, they've taken stuff, they've brought him back in again. And I think at this point is when they're interviewing Kathy as well. Now, in this interview, do you notice that he's never in a rush to understand what evidence they have against him? And to me, that there is indicative of someone who's not particularly concerned. Because if you actually have done something wrong, and look, I've never done anything as wrong as a crime, but we've all lied to our parents before about things. When you're starting to get found out, you want to know why they're saying that and you want to go into defense mode quite quickly, right? He doesn't, though. He doesn't seem particularly curious about what information they have against him with the bullet. Yeah, he looks at it, but he's not taking in that report and saying, I need to kind of figure it all out so I have a defense or I have a rationale. He doesn't at all buy into the conversation around he maybe lent it out to someone, which would just be an obvious one, right? Like, I mean, 5 years later, he could say, I lent it to someone, I can't remember who it was. And whilst that would still look dodgy, it can give him like a plausible reason that his gun might have been, his bullet might have been at the scene. Even saying, well, yeah, like I've hunted there before with the gun, so it possibly dropped then. But he doesn't come up with any excuses because he's just like, it didn't happen. I don't need to worry about this. And again, I think for myself, how I would react in that situation, I think I'd probably be quite similar. It's like, when you've done the wrong thing, and I'm again talking about like doing something wrong at home with your mom or dad or your partner or whatever, you either, when you've done the wrong thing, act super nice because you don't want them to realize that you've done the wrong thing, or you act super defensive because you're like, oh no, crap, they figured out I've done the wrong thing. And his reaction's right in the middle. It's like he's not being overly nice and he's also not being overly defensive. He's quite calm and measured. And again, I know people go, but calm and measured, psychopath. Right, sure. Okay. So this is the next point. If he's a psychopath, how has he got to, the age there, I think he's in his early 50s, but even if we take the date of the crime, the time of the crime, he was in his mid to late 40s, I believe. How has he got to that point without letting that mask slip at all? I mean, come on. Like, to me, he would have to be one of the biggest master manipulators of all time because I know people now will bring up people like BTK and the Green River Killer, but they committed lots of crimes. And yes, they got away with it for a long time. But when you actually date back, when did they commit their first crime? It was earlier. There were indicators earlier. They didn't just suddenly wake up at 40 something and decide to kill someone. So, whilst BTK didn't get caught till he was a middle-aged man, and yes, he lived in plain sight and nobody guessed it, including his family, the fact is there was a history of crime dating far beyond that, which is really consistent with a psychopathic individual who is really good at living a double life, right? Richard Allen doesn't have any skeletons in his closet that we're aware of. And I'm not saying that that means there wouldn't ever be any, but by now, surely we would have heard something. He's been in a long-term relationship. Yes, BTK had too, but regardless, no one else now has come out to say, well, actually, there was suspicious behavior or deviant behavior previously. There are no other indicators of him being psychopathic other than if he did walk on that bridge, lure those girls out and hurt and murder those poor little girls. The thing is, that's unlikely to happen for the first time at the age he was at. Another point, I sort of thought, okay, here's another point of comparison. Chris Watts, and a lot of us know Chris Watts. He went from, nice family guy to murdering, annihilating his entire family. But Chris Watts, literally, first of all, there's a motive, a terrible motive, but there's a motive. There's some sort of explanation of what happened there. Of course, most of us, nearly all of us, would never act in that way. So I'm not trying to justify his behavior, but there's some sort of understanding there. And secondly, Chris Watts was a terrible liar. When he was actually talking about the girls and Shanann going missing, nobody believed his interview. He looked ridiculously, obviously lying, and he cracked really quickly and then tried to throw Shanann under the bus. So Richard Allen doesn't do that. He's not obviously lying. He's not cracked really quickly and not tried to throw anyone else under the bus. And I know later the confessions come, but we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about the interrogation videos. And at that point, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do anything that Chris Watts did. So here we go again. We're seeing a very different personality from, the family annihilator who suddenly snaps. Chris Watts was also younger, but even so, even if he'd been older and snapped, and we're seeing a very different profile to the psychopathic wolf in sheep's clothing. So a couple more observations, I guess, from the interrogation. So when Kathy comes in and she looks absolutely petrified and broken. I know some people have said she looks terrified of him. She doesn't. She looks confused and unsure, and she is questioning him because wouldn't we all question someone that we love if we've not suddenly been told, actually, maybe this person's bad? Like, there'd be a part of us going, of course not. Like, if somebody came to me now and said that, my sister was responsible for a murder, I'd be like, I don't think so. No, that's not her. She wouldn't do that. But if they just kept going round and round, and we're now in this serious situation where they've raided our house and they've told me that there is evidence, well, I'm going to be in a tailspin. And I think most people would then ask a few questions of that loved one in that situation. And she does that, but she's quite quickly reassured by Richard. He doesn't act like Casey Anthony does. If we ever listen to the conversations between her and her mum and her dad, she's defensive, she's rude, she's kind of really angry at them for asking that. And he actually doesn't try to be all sweet talking and manipulative. He acts like someone who feels upset that it's got to a point where his wife is starting to doubt him. And there's a little bit of frustration when he says, I wouldn't do this, right? But there's also a softness that says, I get it as a human being that they've confused you right now, and I'm sorry you're in this situation. Not, I'm sorry I've put you in this situation, but I'm sorry you're in this situation, and it is related to him because he's the target of their investigation, even though he's potentially done nothing wrong. So that interaction between Richard and Kathy, I don't see that as unusual either, to be honest. And I think of myself in that situation, I'd probably do similar. I know I'm not representative of everyone, so I'm not saying just because I would have done that, well, that means, he's innocent. However, I actually wonder if I do have quite a similar makeup to Richard Allen, if I'm seeing him correctly. I'm not a murderer, that's for sure. But if I see him as innocent, then yeah, I'm somebody who has been more self-conscious, more anxious, more worried about people liking me. And I'm very loyal to people I love. So yeah. So that's my sense with the interview. So he doesn't become enraged. He doesn't show that seething, violent anger. He doesn't seem ridiculously calm and composed and having an answer for everything. What he seems like is somebody who is honestly telling the truth and just is getting so confused and doesn't know why this is happening and is feeling a bit resigned by the end because nobody's listening to him. And he's like, what is the point? Nothing I say works. And I wonder as well if the part of him that says, okay, just arrest me is like, well, then I'll just get a lawyer and we'll prove that there is nothing here because this is ridiculous, right? He believes probably in the legal system and thinks, well, nobody's going to convict me on this because my bullet wasn't at the scene. So, sum up of the interrogation videos, I don't see any red flags. Now, I am not saying that I'm some behavior analyst specialist. I'm not a profiler, but based on the research that I've done and based on my knowledge of people and my own, I think, quite good capacity to read people. I mean, that's the job that I do, and there's a reason I went into that. I don't see a man that looks highly guilty in those videos. I see a man who's actually quite gentle, because realistically, he's getting frustrated, but he actually just keeps quite calm and fair. Like, I know he makes a couple of comments here and there when he's really getting pissed off, but fair enough after all those hours, right? But yeah, and the way that he even sort of speaks about, even when he says the girls' names, it's like he uses their names, he doesn't just say the girl, and he doesn't say, I don't know, I just get this sort of energy of softness around it as opposed to an energy of defensiveness. Okay, so that's the interrogation, and now we'll move to the phone calls. Okay, just had a sniffle moment. So if we go to the phone calls and we try to understand them, because this is probably the part that annoys me more. Because the interrogation, sure, it is absolutely open to interpretation. I'm not a body language expert, and we can all have our own views there and how we would react in that situation. But the phone calls annoys me because most of us don't have a perspective of what it's like to be in a position where our mental health is so compromised and we're in solitary confinement, um, and facing the rest of our life in jail. That's something that a lot of us can't even imagine. We can't imagine what it's like to have a psychotic episode because most of us haven't had one, myself included. So when people say, but he confessed 30 times and he said it this many times, so duh, of course he's guilty, it's it feels too simplistic. And as a therapist, a psychologist, and someone who's very interested in the psychology of human beings and has, dedicated my career to it, I just think that is a really reductionistic view. Let's talk about a few of the things that I noticed through the progression of calls, and then about the confessions themselves. So first of all, you'll notice he's already sounding a bit childlike and defeated in the first call. Like he's definitely, like, not even defeated. It's probably like, I called it effusive. Like he's wanting praise and care. And I think this is maybe where this dependent personality idea has come from, because he desperately wants people to still love him and care about him, and there is a childlikeness to him. Now, that's not unusual. When we are experiencing trauma, there can absolutely be parts of us that are wounded that come to the surface. And if we think about the whole idea of inner child, I know for me, when I'm heavily wounded, and particularly wounded around some of the things that have hurt me in the past, I can become childlike. I think a lot of us can, when you're sobbing and you're crying and you're desperately wanting somebody to listen to you. So in his first call, he's quite verbose. He talks quite a bit. He's animated, and yeah, there's almost a childlike kind of innocence about him. And then we get to the call, I think it's with his mum, around the Bible, and things have started to kind of unravel a bit. He's tangential. He's talking in a way that it's a bit hard to follow. It's a bit, what's the word? Can't think of the word to describe it. But he's gone from someone who's not really religious. When they ask him about church in the interrogations, he's like, no, I don't go to church. No one in my family does, to being really, obsessive almost about it, really. And I use obsessive not in the clinical obsessive term, but, suddenly he's fixated a lot more on it. And the way he's talking around it just feels different. Yeah. And so then we go, so for me, that sort of seems like the early signs of his mind sort of unraveling a little bit and the psychosis starting to slip in. And then when we get to the confessions, there is a marked change in affect. It doesn't even sound like the same person. He's not verbose. He's not saying very much. When he is saying, I did it, I might have done it, I think I did it, first of all, that's not definitive. I think I did it, I might have done it, doesn't sound like a real confession to me. But even if we go beyond that, he's very rigid in what he's saying. He's not saying, I think I did it, maybe I did it because of this, or maybe it was this. He's not offering any further explanation. And again, people will say, well, he didn't want to offer detail. Maybe he's just testing his loved ones to see if they'll still love him no matter what. Well, my point to that is his mum directly says to him, I'll love you no matter what. which is such a beautiful mum moment there. I really want to give her credit for that because that's something I tell my kids every day. I will love you no matter whatever happens in your life, which again shows this beautiful, secure bond with his mum. She says the right thing. So if he was testing, that would be that she passed the test. She's gonna love him no matter what. Um, if he really wanted to confess to his family and see if they would still accept him, wouldn't he also create some sort of story around it? Like, oh, like I had a moment where I cracked. I think it was a psychotic episode, or, he's got a mental health history, not maybe a psychosis history. I don't know his full history, but there are so many ways that he could try to sugarcoat it, I guess, to find a way to absolve at least some of the shame and guilt, but he doesn't do that. It's just these repetitive statements, these sort of compulsive statements too. There's a compulsiveness to it. And this is where I started to think about his anxiety again. And I thought, I wonder, like, what is his history of anxiety? Because I specialize in the treatment of OCD and myself have had OCD. That's what sparked my very early interest in OCD and my desire to study psychology in the first place. And people with OCD, and not just people with OCD, but people in general can have this, they can have this capacity to have false memories. It's actually a subtype of OCD called false memory type OCD. And this is where an individual with OCD goes back over something that happened in the past and can almost create this additional layer to it of doubt about what they did. So this is where someone's driven home and then they've gone, did I run over someone? I might have. Maybe I did. Maybe I'm not sure. And they'll go back and check. Or in the case of people I work with who may have harm-related OCD, where they worry they've hurt somebody or they've done something deviant or inappropriate in the past, they'll start adding all these layers onto the story. That's the OCD kind of supercharges the memory in a way that makes the person go, gosh, I might be a really bad person. We call this like the feared self. Like the person with OCD starts having this fear that maybe I was this really bad person in the past and maybe I'll be this person again. Now, I think you can probably see how this links in here. If he's the sort of person that fears he's a bad person or fears that people will think he's a bad person, he could be creating a story in his mind because of his mental health issues that he is a bad person. And now he's regurgitating it over and over again because that's kind of like a compulsion and it's trying to neutralize, it's trying to make sense of it. And confessing is actually a really common symptom of OCD. So people with OCD or more OCD inclined, even if they don't meet full criteria for OCD, have this tendency to need to confess what they've done wrong because there's a huge guilt proneness and shame proneness there. I've done this myself. I've looked back at things that happened, 10 years ago and gone, at the time I did it, I felt a bit yuck about it. But now I've added all these additional layers going, I was really bad. I was just terrible when I did that. We start creating a bigger story, not because we want to, because who would want to do that, but because your mind is trying to just keep filling in gaps. Now, even if we move away from OCD and we look at some of the science and research around false memories, there are studies that show up to 30% of people have created false autobiographical memories or facts around an autobiographical memory that are false. Our memories are not super reliable. And then we add in that this man is in solitary confinement. So he's not having a whole heap of interaction and connection with the outside world. He's stuck with his thoughts all day. You can just imagine how he could be like just going around and around and not being able to see which was my thought, which is real, which is OCD or anxiety or psychosis as well when we throw that into the mix. And it's so interesting because when he confesses to Dr. Weiler, which is the only one where there's detail, and of course we haven't heard this, but based on what she says, he does give a detail or a few details that have now led people to say, well, see, he must be the person. And one of the key details was to do with the bullet. Now, first of all, the bullet detail is inaccurate because based on his story, he racked the gun somewhere around the bridge area to get the girls to sort of move down the hill. Or, I mean, that's kind of the assumption based on what he says, but the bullets found at the crime scene. So it just doesn't match the timeline that he's talking about. But secondly, what did the police go on about in their interrogation? The bullet. So that idea of the bullet has been planted. Not, I'm not saying they're planting it in that sense. I mean, maybe they are, who knows? But that's kind of going to be the memory he has around them saying he did the crime. So the bridge, the bullet, they kind of fit with that idea. The van's a difficult one, and that's the one I think that was the clincher for a lot of people. I think with the van, there is some uncertainty around the phone data and the timeline of the van. Yeah, that one is a hard one. If it is that the timing is incorrect as per the video that we've seen, well, then that makes a lot of sense. That the van aspect has come up. I mean, maybe as well, because that road leads to Brad Weber's parents' residence. So he may even know that that's the van that he's seen on that road. I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying, and look, I'm not trying to reason away that evidence because I'm not an expert in that, but there could be other reasons. And he did say van, not white van. So, I don't know. Are there lots of vans in Delphi? I don't know. But going back to the confessions and the content and the way that he speaks in those phone calls, to me, it's quite obvious that he is a person whose mental state is deteriorating. There is a marked change in affect. And I just can't think of a good reason to fake that because he wasn't trying to use the insanity defense. Secondly, he wasn't he could have then used the confessions as a way to make up stuff that exonerates him too. He didn't do that. And then thirdly, something that we haven't heard, but there is talk around him making confessions about other things that he definitely didn't do. Again, speaking to this idea of maybe some false memories. The final point I want to make is that sense that maybe somebody is behind him, pushing him to say things, whether it's the Odinist guards and things. But even if it's no other human being, it could be the persecutory part of him. So again, this falls into that sort of false self idea. There could be a part of him that is actually saying you need to tell the truth, or not the truth, actually, it's probably not the best way to say, you need to tell people you did this. Really similar to someone who has more of a suicidal persecutory belief that says you need to hurt yourself. That's another possibility here. So maybe he was feeling pressured. He's feeling pressured by another part of him because of the psychosis, and maybe also anxiety that is pressuring him to disclose information. Whatever's going on, it doesn't sound natural. It doesn't, to me, sound like a person who is truly confessing. We know there's a lot of other information there around medication and psychosis. I don't know every single detail, but I hope that all makes sense. So my final point, what would I love to do? I would love to have Richard Allen's historical mental health history. I would love to know if there was ever any indication of OCD or OCD-like themes. I'd love to know what were some of the core beliefs or schemas that he had that were part of his anxiety and depression presentation over, lots and lots of years of his life, because I think that is a missing piece of the puzzle. Because I can tell you, as somebody who has a history of OCD and a tendency towards shame and guilt, we call this scrupulosity OCD, I would be the sort of person that might potentially start generating new layers on a memory that make me seem worse than I am. And maybe if I got pushed to the limit, being in solitary confinement away from my comfort system and facing a life in prison on my own, maybe I would go into a psychotic episode and then unravel and start to be unsure what was my OCD mind and what was, the truth. And I may feel the need to confess to something I hadn't done. So trying to give you here an insight as a psychologist, but also the lived experience of somebody with a history of anxiety. I hope all of that helps. Based on the psychological profile and the information that I've seen in the phone calls and the interrogation videos, if that were the only information I had, I would find this person not guilty. I'm not reasoning away all of the other evidence. There is definitely some things that are hard to understand as coincidences, but the psychological perspective here is that Richard Allen does not meet the profile of a man who just happens to go out on a bridge one day and opportunistically lure two little girls down a hill and kill them in cold blood, and then live the rest of his life, well, 5 more years of his life, as though nothing ever happened. I hope that helps. I hope that makes sense. Yes, I know everyone has lots of different opinions. Happy to hear them. Let's try not to have any hate here, though, because I'm not trying to be controversial in my opinion here. I'm not trying to back a child killer, because I think that's kind of the comments that I've heard on other people's videos. I'm just trying to open up a discussion about a possibility here, and maybe the reason why so many people are struggling to truly accept that the right person is in jail for this crime. So much love to everybody, and I'm happy to provide more updates if you've got any other questions.